A lot of people think that Green Acres was just funny. Well, it was funny, but also everybody sort of sympathized with me and thinking and didn't realize that they were putting themselves in my shoes, where I was fairly decent. I did the best I could, but I'm surrounded with weirdos.
Green Acres usually brings to mind a slick New York lawyer in a three-piece suit standing in a ridiculous farmhouse trying to explain common sense to a town that seems allergic to it. Eddie Albert made Oliver Wendell Douglas look flustered, funny, and oddly dignified, even when the pig had better social standing than he did. But long before Hooterville, Albert had lived a life that sounds too strange for one man. Paperboy, college graduate, trapeze performer, nightclub singer, Broadway actor, Hollywood leading man, intelligence operative, Navy officer, and battlefield rescuer. He was not some pampered celebrity who played soldier for publicity. By the time World War II came, Eddie Albert was already successful, already recognizable, and old enough to avoid the most dangerous work. Instead, he went straight toward it. Before Eddie Albert became the familiar face of Green Acres, he built one of the most impressive and surprising military careers in Hollywood history. The Man Before Hooterville.
I was blessed with a certain talent, acting talent apparently, and a reasonable voice, and I used to sing in school, in high school, and then I began to earn money by singing at night, 50 cents, $1, something like that. And I was thinking this morning driving here, remembering when I was 15, we would go around and sing in movie theaters amateur nights.
Eddie Albert was born Edward Albert Heimberger on April 22, 1906. His early years didn't exactly point towards sitcom immortality. He grew up in Minneapolis, the oldest of 5 children, and started working when he was just a boy. At 6, he was already a paperboy, which says plenty about the world he came from. He wasn't raised inside Hollywood comfort. He learned early that life usually expected you to pull your weight before it handed you applause. His German surname also followed him around during a difficult time. He attended school during World War I, when German names could make a child an easy target. Kids taunted him over Heimberger, and years later, the entertainment business added another insult by mangling it into hamburger. That mispronunciation helped push him towards the simpler stage name, Eddie Albert. Albert attended the University of Minnesota and earned a degree in business, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The stock market crash of 1929 wrecked opportunities for countless young people, and Albert's planned business career never really got off the ground. Like many Americans during the Depression, he took whatever work he could find. The jobs he picked up sound like a casting director threw darts at a wall. He worked as a trapeze performer, an insurance salesman, and a nightclub singer. That odd mixture gave him something formal training could not always provide. He learned balance, charm, timing, hustle, and how to hold a room's attention before anyone gave him a movie contract. The Showbiz Climb.
The director that really taught me most of what I know about comedy, George Abbott. I was on radio in the early 30s.
It wasn't this century, wasn't it?
Pardon me?
It wasn't this century, wasn't it?
Yes, right after the war.
Right.
Yeah. And he brought me on to Brother Rat, and it was a big success. And I went there to room service, and from there to Boys from Syracuse.
By 1933, Albert had moved to New York, where his career began taking shape. He co-hosted a radio program called The Honeymooners, Grace and Eddie Show, long before that title would make people think of Jackie Gleason. Radio gave him visibility, but Broadway gave him a real stage. He moved into theater work and then into early television, building the kind of career that came from steady motion rather than overnight luck. Albert made his Hollywood film debut in Brother Rat in 1938. From there, he became a familiar and reliable screen presence. He could sing, act, handle comedy, and play earnest without seeming stiff. That flexibility kept him working for decades. But in the late 30s and early 40s, his career was still rising. It's what makes his military service more striking. Plenty of famous people served during World War II, but Albert was not a young unknown trying to prove himself. He had already made it to Hollywood. He could have contributed through entertainment tours, bond drives, or safer public morale work. Instead, he stepped into a very different role. Before the U.S. entered the war, Albert reportedly toured Mexico as a clown and high-wire artist while secretly working for Army intelligence. His job was to photograph German U-boats using performance as a cover. That sounds like something from a spy serial, but it fits his strange skill set perfectly. The same talents that made him useful on stage also made him useful in intelligence work. He knew how to perform, how to blend into unusual environments, how to keep people watching the act instead of the man behind it. Eddie Albert's road to war didn't begin with a rifle. It began with a camera, a cover story, and nerves steady enough to pull it off. Into the Navy. Albert enlisted in the Navy in 1942. A year later, he was discharged so he could accept an officer position in the Naval Reserve. By then, he was in his late 30s, which is worth remembering. He was not a fresh-faced teenager swept up in a patriotic wave. He was a grown man with a career, options, and a great deal to lose. He was assigned to the Pacific Theater and eventually served aboard the USS Sheridan. His work placed him near one of the most brutal amphibious operations of the war, the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943. Tarawa was part of the island-hopping campaign, a key step towards pushing closer to Japan. On paper, it was small. In reality, it was a nightmare. The fighting centered on Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll. The U.S. needed the Gilbert Islands for air and naval bases, but the Japanese defenders were heavily dug in and determined to hold the island. The battle lasted from November 20th to 23rd, 1943, and became one of the costliest and most intense early lessons in the Pacific. American planners had prepared carefully, but the assault ran into terrible problems. Poor intelligence, inaccurate maps, and unexpected resistance turned the landing into chaos. The coral reefs created a deadly trap. Many landing craft could not get close enough to shore, which forced Marines to leave their boats hundreds of yards from the beach and wade in through water under enemy fire. That's where Eddie Albert's war story moves from interesting to astonishing. He was serving as a landing craft commander and salvage officer. His job wasn't to become a one-man rescue operation. His assignment was to recover equipment after the worst of the fighting. But war rarely respects job descriptions. Tarawa.
One of the Marines said, if you come back, bring us some rifles. And somebody in the back there yelled, "You heard the kid. Go on home and bring us back some rifles." I did get some things they could fight with, but when I got back, they were all gone. They'd been killed. They wanted to go on in. That was their job. So I picked them up and took them for proper burial.
As the Marines struggled through the surf, Japanese fire cut into them. The water filled with dead and wounded men. Some accounts placed nearly 100 wounded in the water, with many more killed. The scene was so dangerous, simply moving toward the beach meant inviting fire from shore. Albert saw what was happening and ignored the safer limits of his mission. Instead of focusing on equipment, he turned towards the wounded Marines. He and his crew began pulling men out of the water while under heavy fire. He took wounded men back to other ships for medical care, then returned to do it again. Different accounts give slightly different totals, but they agree on the scale of what he did. Albert personally helped rescue more than 40 Marines, with some accounts saying he pulled 47 to safety and oversaw the rescue of about 30 more. Other summaries place the total number of lives saved between 50 and 70. However the figures are counted, the heart of the story stays the same. He went back into danger again and again. For those actions, Albert received the Bronze Star with a Combat V for valor. It was not a ceremonial decoration handed to a celebrity for showing up. It was earned in terrifying conditions during one of the hardest battles of the Pacific War. Tarawa also forced the U.S. military to rethink amphibious assault tactics because the cost exposed serious problems in planning, equipment, and landing operations. One story stayed with Albert for years. He once encountered Marines who were unharmed but had lost their weapons when their craft went down. He offered to take them back to safety. They refused. They wanted weapons so they could continue fighting. Albert later returned only to find many of them had been killed. When he spoke of Tarawa later, he tended to focus less on his own courage and more on men like that. Back to the screen.
What do you do?
I'm in the same racket as Joe, only I'm a photographer. I'm awfully sorry, Earth. What are you... I'm sorry, Earth. Look, I can take a hint.
After the war, Albert returned to acting, but he wasn't simply picking up where he left off. He carried Tarawa with him. He'd seen a kind of courage that most audiences would never fully understand, and he'd played a part in saving lives during a disaster on the water. His career went on for decades. He appeared in films like Roman Holiday, Escape to Witch Mountain, Miracle of the White Stallions, and You Gotta Stay Happy. He earned 2 Academy Award nominations and built a long resume across film, television, and stage. He also received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Yet his political activism complicated parts of his post-war life. During the Red Scare, he was labeled a communist, and blacklisting reportedly hurt his career and finances. His son later said Albert stayed committed to his beliefs despite the pressure. For a decorated war hero to be treated with suspicion at home adds another strange turn to an already unusual life. Then came Green Acres, the role that made him a household name for a new generation. As Oliver Wendell Douglas, Albert played the straight man in a world that had gone delightfully sideways. The comedy was broad, silly, and often surreal, but Albert gave it just enough seriousness to make the whole thing work. Many viewers remember him standing next to Ava Gabor, arguing about farm life, neighbors, and a pig named Arnold. But when Albert was asked which accomplishment meant the most to him, he reportedly pointed not to Hollywood, Broadway, awards, or fame. He pointed to his time as a landing craft commander at Tarawa. For Eddie Albert, the proudest role wasn't Oliver Douglas. It was the one that helped wounded Marines live to see another day. Now it's time to hear from you. Did you know Eddie Albert had this kind of military record before Green Acres? And does it change the way you see him when you watch those old episodes today? Let us know in the comment section below.